our Russian rocket motor wound up on the American Atlas rocket, and the discussion began with the technical design, the political environment at the time. All right, we're saying that basically the political environment is more poignant now because history seems to be repeating itself with an oppressive government versus a democratic government. And we were talking about why the RD-180 engine is considered the gold standard of rocket motors. The RD-180 engine delivered 15% more thrust than any other engine its size, and it delivered almost twice as much thrust as the thrust of the space shuttle main engines, which is pretty amazing. The RD-180 engine, one of them, replaced 4 smaller rocket engines on the Atlas rocket. So let's look at the differences in design between a standard rocket engine and the RD-180. All other rocket motors employ what is called an open circuit system. Fuel and liquid oxygen are pumped at very high pressure by a turbine to be mixed in the combustion chamber and then ignited, which creates the thrust. Now, the turbine is also powered by the same fuel in what's called a pre-burning chamber. The exhaust from the pre-burner is still rich in fuel and oxygen, but because of the heat and pressure, it's expelled as waste. The designers of the RD-180 engine employed a closed circuit system. They found a way to channel the exhaust from the pre-burner back into the combustion chamber, creating more thrust and more efficiency. Now, we're going to look at this down the line as to what the secret was for the Russians. All right. The discussion basically ends at the fact that, well, the Russians didn't necessarily have the engineering know-how to create this. They were masters of one science over any other nation across the earth, and that's the science of metallurgy. They managed to create stainless steel systems that could handle the heat and pressure of the exhaust from the turbine and use that to pump it back into the firing combustion chamber. Now, how did the devices come to the U.S. space program? And this is the part that I love. Everybody knows I love to give context to things. To answer the question, we have to talk about the political topic, climate at the time. The Union of Socialists, never pronounce this, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, our communist enemy, had collapsed on December 26, 1991, and was eventually replaced with the Russian Federation. Now, in 2000, the Russian Federation was a fragile, cash-strapped democracy, eager for new avenues of commerce. Technologies which were once state secrets have become available for trade. In the mid-1990s, a group of engineers from Lockheed Martin and a company called Aerojet were visiting Russia and making contacts within the Russian Space Agency. The American engineers were specifically interested in obtaining Russian rocket motor designs that they might be able to resell in the American market. Now, little by little, the engineers began to hear rumors about a Russian rocket motor which might be available for sale. And as they obtained the performance specification data, the data seemed just too good to be true. The Russians were giving them performance records that represented a complete paradigm shift in engine performance. So the Americans were obviously skeptical, until they were finally contacted by a former employee of the Kuznetsov Design Bureau. Now, this is the chief rocket manufacturer for the space program of the former USSR and the rocket engine that was being marketed to the Americans. And when the Americans challenged the Kuznetsov data, the Russian engineer did something unprecedented. He offered to show the engines to the Americans. Okay. Now, the Americans were stunned by the offer, but they agreed to inspect the engine. Travel arrangements were made, and the Americans were then taken to Siberia. They were taken to a disused, abandoned, and rusting warehouse in a rural part of Russia called Samara. When the warehouse doors opened, the Americans beheld a forest of 60 NK-33 rocket engines produced by the Russians in pristine condition. The Kuznetsov engineer explained that the rocket motors were left over from the USSR's last attempt at landing a man on the moon. The motors had been sitting there, unknown, untouched, for over 20 years. The Kuznetsov engineer explained the Russians stood by their claims. One of the engines was purchased, arrangements were made to bring the engine to California, where it was tested. The engine met every single one of the Russian specifications. So how does the most sophisticated rocket motor ever designed wind up in a disused, abandoned, rusting warehouse in the backwoods of the Soviet Union? Keep in mind, we weren't able to replicate this technology ourselves until about 3 years ago. And they had it back in 1974, and they buried it in a warehouse. So to answer the question, we have to go back in time to before the space race even began. Now, we can state very clearly when the space race began, even the exact date was October 4th, 1957. And many people who were old enough to remember the 1950s today remember what the world was like before October 4th, the day after. Most Americans at the time were focused on the World Series. The underdog Milwaukee Braves were pitted against the New York Yankees. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll. Gas was 25 cents a gallon. And millions of families were tuning in to watch a brand new TV show called Leave It to Beaver. About half a world away, in deepest secrecy, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, our enemy, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was planning something. All right, so that rocket, atop that rocket said the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, whose name in Russian means traveling companion. This is an aluminum sphere about 23 inches in diameter and weighing 185 pounds. Hold on, I'm going to jump back to something here. The R-7 rocket was a two-stage. The R-7 rocket was a two-stage vehicle which stood 112 feet high, was capable of carrying a payload of up to 5 metric tons, a distance of 8,000 miles. This was fueled by kerosene and liquid oxygen. The R-7 was the world's first true intercontinental ballistic missile. Sputnik was on top of that rocket. It was polished so that it would shine like a star. It generated a constant beeping radio signal that could be heard by anybody with a radio. The Russians are very careful to make this very public. Sputnik was in orbit for only 92 days, but it passed over American airspace a total of 2,880 times. The world was fascinated. The United States was terrified. The USSR demonstrated the ability to penetrate the United States airspace with a rocket powerful enough to deliver a hydrogen bomb. But as you can imagine, the United States was terrified. And here's some quotes the day after Sputnik went into space. Leadership in the United States was deeply concerned. The people of the United States are disturbed, they've been humiliated, and they're unhappy. This enemy of ours has outdistanced us. That's Sam Rayburn, Speaker of the House of Representatives. We're headed downhill to the status of a second-rate world power. We don't want to become hysterical, but let's be factual. Let's start telling the truth, and let's face the fact that we've taken a licking psychologically and scientifically, and it's embarrassed us throughout the world. If Russia wins dominance over this completely new era, well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination. That last quote was from Jimmy Doolittle, the general who led the raid against the Japanese in World War II. So what went wrong? How did a nation of backwards peasants forge so dramatically ahead of us in the space race? The last quote by the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev: the United States now sleeps under a Soviet moon. So how did the Russians get so far ahead of us? Ironically, it was because of Soviet technological inferiority. The United States nuclear defense program was bomber-based. We had a huge number of propeller and jet-driven aircraft, including the B-52, which came online in 1955, just outside of Russian airspace. In the event of nuclear war, these bombers could be at their targets inside the Soviet Union in as little as 2 hours. We could easily maintain our defense posture continuously. Russians, on the other hand, lacked the engineering ability to create a large, long-range bomber fleet and also lacked bases near the US border. As late as the 1950s, the Soviet Union still lacked a long-range bomber. Now, the Russians realized they could never match the United States' ability to manufacture aircraft and began their own missile program in secret, beginning in 1946. So how did the Russians progress? We're going to abbreviate some history here. In October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was put up. November 3rd, 1957, first living animal in space. January 4th, 1959, the first object in heliocentric orbit. September 14th, 1959, first impact into another celestial body, the moon. October 7th, 1959, the first photos of the far side of the moon. Keep in mind, we didn't know what the other side of the moon looked like until this happened. And of course, the most powerful statement of Russian technical superiority of all: human spaceflight. Yuri Gagarin was launched aboard a rocket called Vostok 1 and successfully orbited the Earth, the first manned spaceflight, on April 11th, 1961. At this time, the President of the United States was John F. Kennedy, and by now, American politicians and the American people were demanding that Kennedy take action to restore American morale and diplomatic prestige in the world. One of the keys to this is that while we were in a war with the Russians, we were losing the peace. Okay, the Russians, with this program, were able to convince a lot of nations to go over to their side. Nations convinced that they were defended better by the Soviet Union. So politicians and the public were demanding that Kennedy authorize a mission to put an American on the moon. The American people, American politicians were pressuring President Kennedy to do something, and there were calls for the president to take the lead and put a man on the moon. But believe it or not, Kennedy was, as he said when he first became president, not that into space initially. Also, because of the fact that the Russians seemed to be proving themselves more and more, he was extremely insecure about starting a space program that he really didn't believe that we could fund and be successful at. So we all remember the speech from Rice University, that great speech in, I think it's November 1962. Kennedy needed a win. Kennedy needed a win. You need something factual to support a public declaration to put a man on the moon. He eventually gets it in the form of NASA's Mercury space program. Over the next few months, NASA successfully puts a man into space 5 times. Now Kennedy has the confidence to go before the American people and proclaim that we will be the first to put a man on the moon. So NASA is fully funded, continues to experience successes, and moves from the Mercury mission to the next step, which is Gemini. So we move from 1 person in space to 2 persons in space. Gemini begins to practice docking missions, basically extravehicular activity, trips into space. All the while, they're developing the Saturn rocket motors. And we can see here basically these different rocket motors. The first one was the RL-10. This was, I think, on the, honestly, I don't remember. But we've got the H-1 rocket motor, the J-2, which was the second stage rocket motor for the Saturn. And then we had the Saturn V, which was the F-1. One of these engines could put out 1.6 million pounds of thrust. And as I said, the efficiency and power has only been exceeded in the last 3 years. Now, by 1965, it's becoming clear to the Soviet Union that the Americans have not only caught up to the Russians, but also that the Americans are beginning to pass them. The Russians decide that it's time for them to develop their own heavy rocket system to take them to the moon. The Americans have the Saturn V rocket on the left, and the Russians develop the N-1 rocket. Now, both of these rockets are similar in power and function, but they're both engineered very differently. Okay. So for the purposes of our discussion, we need to look specifically at the engine designs for the first stage of the rocket, which is the stage that's going to get the rocket off the ground. The Americans favored 5 very large, powerful rockets for their first stage. The Russians lacked the ability to create very large engines, so they created a cluster of 36 smaller engines. But even with so many engines, the Russians still needed to squeeze out every ounce of thrust so they could get out of the design. They were forced to develop the closed circuit design, which would give each engine 25% more thrust. Now, there was one other major difference between the 2 rocket systems. The Americans tested every single engine, every single component before the rocket was launched. The Russians, and this is where fabrication and engineering and funding come in, because the Russians did not have the ability to even develop proper test stands for everything that they put out. The Russians lacked the technical ability to test their rocket components on the ground. In fact, only 1 rocket engine in 6 was ever tested before it was put onto the N-1 rocket. All other components would have to be tested in flight. The Russians had 4 launches of the M1 moon rocket system beginning in 1967. The rocket that they used on the first launches was called the NK-15. The last launch of the M1 rocket was in 1974, but after that launch, the Russians had finally perfected their rocket motor and called it the NK-33. Okay. So at this point, the Russian engineers, someone had taken it upon themselves to rescue this engine. This was their life's work. This was an achievement that had been excelled, that they had excelled every other nation, and they knew it. So someone decided that they were going to take these last 60 engines and they were going to hide them in secret. Now, keep in mind that if the government had found out about this, if the KGB had found out about what these engineers were doing, they would have been killed or they would have been in prison. So they were taking their lives into their own hands. by secreting these engines away. And that's how this rocket engine, which was 50 years ahead of its time, this technology that was beyond anything any other nation had accomplished up until the 2020s, wound up in a rusting warehouse in the backwoods of Siberia until they were discovered, until they were mentioned again in 1992 and found for the engineers of Aerojet Rocketdyne. So this is the end of our journey right now. It's great to be able to see this kind of a story. It's great to be able to see engineering and intelligence kept and maintained for future generations. But unfortunately, that's the end of our journey. And in the words of my favorite YouTuber, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.